Here we'll introduce the Python special method call, which is call delimited by double underscores, which we'll call dunderCall for short. This method allows objects of our own design to become callable, just like functions. To demonstrate, we'll make a caching version of our DNS resolver in a file resolver.py. We're using PyCharm in this example, but you can use any text editor, preferably one which supports Python syntax highlighting. Occasionally, we would like to have a function which maintains some state between calls. In general, implementing functions for which the return value depends on the arguments to previous calls is frowned upon, and rightly so, because of the difficulty of reasoning about and therefore testing and debugging such functions. That said, there are legitimate cases for retaining information within a function between calls, such as to implement a caching policy to improve performance. In such cases, the values returned by the function given particular arguments are not changed, but the time within which a result is produced may be reduced. Notice that just like any other method, dunderCall accepts self as its first parameter, although we won't need to provide this when we call it. Now let's test this from the Python REPL. We must call the constructor of our class to create an instance object, which, because we implemented the dunderCall method, can be called like a function. This is really just syntactic sugar for spelling the dunderCall method name out in full, but we would never do this in practice. Since resolve is an object of type resolver, we can retrieve its attributes to inspect the state of the cache. The underscore cache attribute, which is a dictionary, contains just a single entry. Let's make another function call. Now we see that the cache has grown. In order to convince ourselves that the caching is working as designed, we can run some simple timing experiments using the Python standard library timeit module, which contains a handy timing function, also called timeit. For reasons we won't go into now, the timeit function accepts two code snippets as strings, one of which is used to perform any setup operations, and the other of which is the code for which the elapsed time will be reported. The function also accepts a number argument, which is a count of how many times the code under test will be run. In our case of testing a cache, it's important that we set this to 1. Since our code to be timed will refer to names in the current namespace, that of the REPL, we must specifically import them from the REPL namespace, which is called dunderMain, into the namespace used by timeit. You can see here that the DNS lookup took 688 microseconds. Now execute the same line of code again. This time the time taken is short enough that Python reports it in scientific notation. Let's ask Python to report it without scientific notation using the str.format method, relying on the fact that the special underscore variable stores the previous REPL result. Now it's easier to see that the result is returned from the cache in around 8 microseconds, a factor of 100 faster. Our callable object has been instantiated from a regular class, so it's perfectly possible to define other methods within that class, giving us the ability to create functions which also have methods. For example, let's add a method called clear to empty the cache and another method called hasHost to query the cache for the presence of a particular host. Let's exercise our modified resolver in a fresh REPL session. First, we import and instantiate our resolver callable as before. Then we can check whether a particular destination has been cached, which it has not in this case, although of course resolving that host by invoking our callable changes that result. Now we can test that cache clearing works as expected, which of course it does. So we see how the special dunderCall method can be used to define classes, which when instantiated can be called using regular function call syntax. This is useful when we want a function which maintains state between calls and optionally needs to support attributes or methods to query and modify that state.